The wind rattled the old windows of the Mitchell house on Maple Street as Caroline Mitchell stirred her tea, watching the steam curl into the dimly lit kitchen. The house had been in her family for generations, a place of love, warmth, and history. But lately it felt different. A presence lurked in the air, shifting things ever so slightly, as if the walls themselves were whispering a warning. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the sugar jar, only to find it wasn't where she left it. Again, this wasn't the first time. She frowned, glancing around. Had she moved it? No, she was sure she hadn't. But lately, things had been shifting in ways she couldn't explain. Keys vanishing, books rearranged, small objects misplaced. It had started ever since she arrived. Amy. Caroline had been excited when her son, Tommy, announced his engagement. At 32, he had spent much of his life working, barely visiting home. When he asked if he and Amy could stay at the house for a while to save money, Caroline had welcomed them with open arms. But from the moment Amy set foot in the house, Caroline had felt something was off. The way she smiled, too perfect, too calculated. The way she looked at the house, not with admiration, but possession. And now, things were shifting. Morning, Caroline. Amy's voice was like honey, smooth and sweet, but artificial. She breezed into the kitchen, her perfectly manicured fingers gliding over the countertop as if it were already hers. Caroline forced a smile. Morning. Amy glanced at the sugar jar. Oh, I moved that. Thought it'd be easier to reach here. Caroline's fingers tightened around her cup. My house. My kitchen. But she said nothing. Tommy entered, running a hand through his dark hair. Morning, Mom. Did you sleep okay? She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him about the eerie feeling, the way the house felt different, the way Amy's presence seemed to bend reality around her. But she just nodded. Fine. Amy leaned into Tommy's side, her blue eyes watching Caroline carefully. Tommy and I were thinking of having some of our friends over this weekend. Just a small gathering. Caroline raised an eyebrow. A party? Amy let out a light laugh. Oh, not a party. Just some wine, some music. It'll be fun. Caroline's stomach twisted. This was her home, her sanctuary, yet she felt like an outsider. But Tommy smiled, and that was all it took for her to feel like a villain if she said no. Fine, she murmured. Amy's lips curled into a satisfied smile. That night, Caroline lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. A strange noise crept through the house. Soft footsteps, barely audible, as if someone was watching. She sat up, heart pounding. Was it just her imagination? Slowly, she got up, pulling her robe tightly around herself. The hallway was dark, but a sliver of light glowed from downstairs. The kitchen light was on. Her pulse quickened. She had turned everything off before bed. Cautiously, she stepped down the stairs, her breath shallow. The house creaked under her feet. She reached the kitchen, peering inside. Empty. Her shoulders relaxed, until she noticed the back door was unlocked. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. The wind howled outside, and a shadow flickered just beyond the doorway. Someone was out there. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she backed away, her eyes darting around the kitchen. The sugar jar moved again. The chairs shifted. And then something chilling. On the kitchen counter, in her own handwriting, was a note she didn't remember writing. Stop resisting. This house isn't yours anymore. A chill ran down her spine. A rustle came from the dark hallway. She turned. Amy stood there, bathed in the dim glow of the light, her head tilted slightly, her eyes unreadable. Couldn't sleep? Amy whispered. Caroline swallowed hard. Did you hear anything? Amy's lips curved. Just you. Caroline felt something shift in the air between them, an unspoken challenge. A war had begun, and she was losing. Caroline knows Amy is slowly taking control, but now it's more than just manipulation. Something darker is at play. And the worst part? Tommy is blind to it. Caroline woke up with a start. The cold morning air seeped through the house, but it wasn't the chill that had startled her awake. Something felt different, wrong. She listened carefully, her ears straining for any sound. A creak, A whisper of movement. Someone was awake. She slipped out of bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped cautiously into the hallway. The light from downstairs was on again. Her heart pounded as she moved closer. Amy stood in the kitchen, her back turned, her hands moving over the counter. She was mumbling under her breath, her voice too low for Caroline to understand. "Amy!" Amy jumped slightly, turning with a too quick smile. "Oh, didn't mean to wake you. What are you doing?" Amy held up a glass. "Just getting water. Couldn't sleep." Caroline's eyes flickered to the counter. The sugar jar had been moved again. The chairs were slightly off. The rug in the hallway was folded at the corner, something Caroline always fixed before bed. Small, insignificant details, but they felt like warnings. "You should go back to sleep," Amy said softly. Caroline nodded, but as she turned to leave, Amy spoke again. "You look tired, Caroline. Maybe you should rest more. Stress can do strange things to people." Caroline froze. A cold dread settled in her chest. She returned to her room, locking the door. Sleep didn't come. The next morning, Tommy was distant. He barely looked up from his phone, distracted, while Amy moved around the kitchen effortlessly, acting as if she had lived there for years. "You didn't sleep well," Amy noted. Caroline sipped her tea. "I heard noises." Amy gave a sympathetic smile. "Maybe you were dreaming." Caroline tightened her grip on the cup. Tommy finally looked up. "Mom, Amy told me about last night. You've been acting off." A sharp chill ran through her. "What?" "She said you seemed confused, like you didn't remember things." Caroline's breath caught. Amy sighed. "We're just worried about you." Caroline forced a smile. "I'm fine." Amy's expression softened, but her eyes told another story. The party was worse than she expected. Strangers filled her house, their voices too loud, their laughter echoing against the walls. Glasses clinked. Music vibrated through the air, and Caroline stood in the middle of it all, feeling like an intruder in her own home. She caught Amy watching her from across the room, a small, knowing smile on her lips. Caroline turned to find Tommy laughing with a group of people she didn't recognize. She tried to reach him, to tell him she needed to talk, but Amy intercepted her. "Everything okay?" "This is what I agreed to." Amy tilted her head. "You seem overwhelmed. Maybe you should lie down." Caroline's pulse quickened. Or, Amy continued, "We could talk about last night, about how you were wandering the house, moving things around. Maybe you don't even remember." Caroline's breath hitched. "I didn't." Amy leaned in, lowering her voice. "Tommy is worried. Maybe it's time to consider that you might need help." Something inside Caroline snapped. "You need to leave," she whispered. Amy laughed softly. "Caroline, this isn't just your house anymore." Caroline turned, calling for Tommy, but he barely glanced at her, too caught up in conversation. The realization hit her like ice. Amy had already won, and Caroline was disappearing. The party stretched into the night. Caroline sat in her room, staring at the locked door, the noise below growing distant. When it finally ended, silence crept through the house like a shadow. Then a knock. She didn't move. Amy's right. Tommy's voice was quiet, tired. "You haven't been yourself." Caroline closed her eyes. "We'll talk in the morning," Tommy said, and his footsteps faded down the hall. Caroline sat there, the weight of it all pressing down. She wasn't losing her mind, but she was losing everything else. Caroline woke up to silence. The house was still, the morning light filtering through the curtains. But something felt different. Off. She sat up slowly, listening. No voices. No movement. She stepped out of her room. The wooden floor cool beneath her feet. The hallway was eerily quiet. Amy's door was slightly ajar, but the room was empty. Tommy's room was the same, neatly made, untouched. Her heart pounded. She moved downstairs. The kitchen was spotless. No dishes in the sink, no clutter on the counter. Even the misplaced sugar jar had been set back in its usual spot. A chill ran through her. The house felt wrong. Too clean. Too perfect. Then she saw it. A note. sitting on the dining table. She reached for it, her hands trembling. "Mom, Amy and I are staying at a hotel for a few days. I think we all need some space. We'll talk soon." Caroline's breath hitched. She sank into a chair, staring at the note, the words blurring before her eyes. They were gone. Amy had finally done it. She had convinced Tommy to leave. Caroline sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The house, once filled with warmth and love, now felt empty, abandoned. She stood slowly, moving through the rooms. Each step felt heavier. She touched the walls, ran her fingers over furniture. It was still her home, but for the first time, she felt like a stranger in it. She walked to the front door and opened it, stepping onto the porch. The crisp morning air stung her skin, the quiet of the street almost suffocating. Then she saw them, Amy and Tommy, standing near the car at the end of the driveway. Amy was talking to him, her hand on his arm. He looked hesitant, unsure. Caroline's chest tightened. Amy turned slightly, locking eyes with Caroline. And then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Caroline clenched the doorframe. No, she wouldn't let this happen. She wouldn't lose her son. Not like this. She stepped forward, calling his name. Tommy looked up, hesitation flickering across his face. But before he could move, Amy whispered something to him. He stiffened. Then, without another word, he got into the car. Caroline's stomach dropped. The engine started. Amy gave her one last glance, her expression unreadable. Then they were gone. Caroline stood there, frozen. The house behind her felt impossibly vast, the emptiness pressing in. She was alone. Again. And this time, she wasn't sure if Tommy would ever come back. Caroline stood at the doorway long after the car had disappeared down the street. The world felt unbearably quiet, the air heavy with something she couldn't name. She stepped back inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The house swallowed her in silence. Her fingers traced the edge of the dining table as she walked past it, the note still sitting there like a cruel reminder. She picked it up, reading Tommy's words over and over, hoping that if she stared long enough, the meaning would change. But it wouldn't. She was alone. Her knees weakened, and she sank into the chair, pressing the note against her chest. A part of her wanted to cry, to break, to let the grief consume her. But another part, one she hadn't heard from in years, whispered something else. You are still here. For the first time in a long while, she listened. She wasn't just the mother Tommy had left behind. She wasn't just the woman Robert had betrayed. She wasn't just someone waiting for love to return. She was Caroline Mitchell, and this was her home. A slow, deliberate calm settled over her. She stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured herself a cup of coffee, the same way she had every morning for decades. The cup was warm in her hands, steady, grounding. Then she began to clean, not out of anger, not out of sadness, but because this was her space and it needed her care. She moved through each room, wiping away fingerprints, rearranging books, fluffing cushions, and throwing open the windows to let in fresh air. She picked up the remains of Amy's presents, the cheap perfume bottle in the bathroom, the decorative pillows she had insisted on, the little touches that had never belonged. One by one, she erased them. By the time evening arrived, the house felt different, not empty, not abandoned, but hers. She lit a candle in the living room, the soft glow flickering against the walls. She curled up in her chair with a book, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood outside. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. Days passed, then weeks. Caroline lived. She found joy in the simple things. Tending the garden, cooking meals just for herself, listening to music she hadn't played in years. And then, one evening, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering. Mom! Tommy's voice was small, uncertain. Her heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. Tommy. A pause. I just want to check on you. She closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. I'm doing just fine, sweetheart. Another pause. He stopped, exhaling. I think I made a mistake. Caroline's fingers tightened around the phone. She had imagined this moment 100 times. But now that it was here, she felt only quiet understanding. "Come home when you're ready," she said softly. "I'll be here." The line stayed silent for a long time. Then finally, "Okay." Caroline smiled. She set the phone down, turned to gaze out the window. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over Maple Street. And for the first time in a long while, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.